Praise belongs to God, the Lord of all worlds, and prayers and peace upon Muhammad, the trustworthy prophet. Peace be upon him. I seek refuge with God, the Exalted, from the accursed Satan. In the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate. All praise is due to God, the Lord of all the worlds. Ladies and gentlemen, several months ago, I had penned an article proposing a new framework Muslims might adopt given the current religious context. I expressed my thoughts on the connection between the state and Islam. Why was it necessary to write this? You all are aware that a specific religious narrative has become problematic for the Muslim community worldwide. Numerous deaths have occurred just in our country. The situation regarding law and order has deteriorated. No one's life is safe. Attacks occur continuously day and night, driven by religious differences stemming from this narrative. The issue doesn't stop here. Afghanistan, our neighboring Muslim nation, has been engulfed in violence and terrorism for nearly half a century. A similar scenario is unfolding in the Middle East recently. The negative impacts of these developments have reached other nations globally. I reside in Malaysia. It seems distant, yet fighters from there join the battle. They believe they are significantly serving Islam. They anticipate divine rewards and paradise is welcome. They assume their jihad is the same commanded in God's book, the Quran. Long ago, I warned the governing elites, scholars, and common Muslims about the deep ideological roots of what they deem a nuisance. It originates from a religious narrative that inspires, organizes, and drives people to drastic actions. This dire situation cannot be altered without in-depth study and understanding of this narrative. Decades ago, when the jihad movement began in Afghanistan, labeled as jihad, I cautioned about the severe consequences it would bring. Now, I still believe that unless the majority of Muslims grasp the seriousness of this situation, the catastrophic potential in the Middle East is unimaginable. Thus, these are grievous sins. Without a doubt, this is the case. However, the question arises, should these be considered criminal acts under secular law as well? These two are distinct matters. Being a sin or a grave transgression is one aspect. We use the term kabira, meaning major sin. It's widely believed that this ummah's great scholars include only Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Al-Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, Imam Al-Bukhari, and Imam Muslim, because the Muslim Ummah commonly identifies with these figures. For instance, in Pakistan and many other countries, people identify as Hanfis. The same holds true for kufr, which means rejection. What does kufr signify? God sends a messenger who made the truth clear to the people. Yet the people refuse to recognize him as God's messenger. Originally, this is precisely what kufr referred to in the Quran. That is, a messenger of God arrived and proceeded to clarify the truth to the people. These scholars are primarily experts in fiqh, jurisprudence. The legal tradition in Islam is known as fiqh. These individuals are the fuqaha, jurists. This field addresses legal obligations. What is fard, obligatory? What is wajib, What is sunnah? What is haram or forbidden? What is makruh, undesirable? These matters fall under the legal discipline. These elders established principles for law formulation and its sources. They disseminated their legal viewpoints. Here, I must reiterate that the term law in Muslim tradition encompasses more than just state law. It covers all aspects, whether individual or collective, regulated by Sharia. Thus, law here has a broader meaning. When this law is elaborated, it appears that many aspects are based on the Quran and others on the ijtihad, independent reasoning, of jurists. Scholars compile the law incorporating all this, then say, for example, this is Hanfi fiqh, this is Maliki fiqh, this is Shafi'i fiqh, or this is Hanbali fiqh. The same applies in hadith. The hadith presents a historical account of knowledge attributed to the Prophet, peace be upon him. I have often stated that the term hadith has become somewhat sacred. However, in reality, it is simply this. Those who witnessed the Prophet, peace be upon him, and heard his words reported what they heard and saw. Can they intervene and forcibly prevent it? In response to this query, our tradition has commonly accepted that idolatry and kufr should in fact be eliminated. That is, systems of Muslims, their government, their systems, if they establish them, the Ummah, should aim at the eradication of idolatry and kufr. They devised principles of historical criticism. How do we verify someone's claim of having heard or seen something? We need certain principles to evaluate this. It's possible that someone is fabricating or misrepresenting what they report. It's also possible that they misunderstood what they're reporting. For such investigations, there's a specific discipline. Islamic historical criticism. Experts in this field, like jurists specializing in law, view everything from a legal perspective. Let me elaborate on this distinction. If you've read older Muslim scholarship or followed traditional debates, you might have encountered an intriguing question. Does faith, Amin, increase and decrease? For instance, a person embraces faith. Early in Islam, the question arose, does his Iman fluctuate? Considering the essence of faith, it clearly does vary, increasing and decreasing. A person's belief state isn't static. Sometimes we feel a stronger connection to God. Other times we're more absorbed in worldly concerns. Sometimes our hearts incline towards prayer. A person might rise at night to remember God. Occasionally, thoughts of God merely flit by without lingering. Likewise, other states of faith occur. For example, we sin in everyday life. We make mistakes. Thus, our faith status changes. While committing a sin, our status differs. The Prophet, peace be upon him, himself stated, while committing theft or adultery, a person is not a believer. Sometimes we reach a state where we even lose our faith entirely. It returns later. A person repents, turns back to God. Sometimes the situation progresses further. For instance, a person may have relatively little faith before sinning, but after repenting their faith reaches its highest level of perfection. Here's an illustrative story. It's said that once Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, a renowned poet and mystic, nearly missed his Fajr prayer. He couldn't awaken in time. Satan appeared to him resembling a devout man and urged him, "Rise, sir, prayer time is almost over." Rumi got up and performed his prayer. Satan then revealed himself to Rumi as Iblis. Rumi questioned him, "I've always heard you lead people towards evil. Why have you roused me for prayer?" Satan replied, "No, I fulfilled my usual duty. You've only performed your prayer. Had you missed it, you would have felt remorse and thus elevated your spiritual status. I opted between lesser and greater goods, aiming to minimize your reward as much as possible. I present this to illustrate that these states continue to change. When this issue was presented to Imam Abu Hanifa, he declared, Al-Iman la yazid wa la yanqus. Faith neither increases nor decreases. This assertion remains despite the obvious nature of the fact. If you examine the Sahih of Al-Bukhari by Imam Al-Bukhari, originally titled Al-Jami al-Sahih, you'll encounter a detailed discussion introduced to argue that faith both increases and decreases. This discussion is set against that backdrop. So, a muhaddith, one who studies hadith, approaches the issue differently. The Quran states that faith increases and decreases. The hadith concurs, as does reason. Humans are constantly changing. I'm aware of this. You also recognize it. Thus, the muhaddith views the issue from this perspective. The jurist, on the other hand, approaches it from a different angle. He might say, a person appears in my court seeking justice, or there's a dispute or an accident. Should I differentiate between the faith of Abu Bakr, may God be pleased with him, and that of an ordinary person? Clearly, I wouldn't. I've shared this example to help you appreciate the significant difference it makes when someone approaches matters from a legal standpoint. As a legal expert, Imam Abu Hanifa is correct in asserting that in the court of justice and regarding citizens' rights, we can't claim that one person has more faith than another. In that domain, everyone must be treated equally. From this perspective, he would argue that faith is not subject to increase or decrease. In my court, under my governance, Abu Bakr, may God be pleased with him, and an ordinary citizen would stand equal. We can't differentiate between them. This is the view from the legal perspective, and these are our jurists, our legal experts, as I mentioned earlier. Then there are the muhaddithun, experts in the study of hadith. In contrast to all of this, some scholars emerged who sought to understand Islam comprehensively. I might explain, for clarity's sake, that they offered an interpretation encompassing the entire religion. Their efforts weren't confined to legal issues alone. They explored questions like, what is religion? What is its essence? Why is it necessary? How does it relate to human life? What is the role of law within it? What about facts? What about beliefs? How do Sharia laws fit into it? Thus, they considered all these aspects. These scholars interpreted the entire religion. If you look closely, you'll see that Hanafi and Shafi'i jurists significantly influence our daily affairs. An ordinary Muslim might by himself not know whether his ablution is valid or his prayer is correct. He relies on the jurists. When the Qadi, judge system was in place, social matters were also adjudicated by them. Questions like whether a particular marriage, nikah, is valid or if a divorce is applicable, among other legal issues, were resolved by these jurists as they are experts in law. Suppose we need to discuss a historical issue, for example. We need to ascertain whether the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, made a certain statement. If he did, under what circumstances did he make it? For such inquiries, we turn to the muhaddithun. But to study the entire religion, or what we might call the philosophy of religion, and questions relating to its foundations, to its relation to its sources, its application to all aspects of human life, we must engage with another discipline. If I combine the previously mentioned viewpoints on faith, I can say that in reality, faith fluctuates, increasing and decreasing, but from a legal perspective, it remains constant. I've mentioned this as an example. This provides us with a complete understanding of the religion. This tradition has also been long-standing. We can't predict how many changes the near future will bring. What great scholars will arise? What critical issues will be confronted? But up to this moment, as I speak to you, many distinguished scholars in this field have appeared. You see that millions have become Hanafis and many others Shafi'is. But if you look closely, the scholars I'm about to describe are equally significant. They aren't often discussed by lay people, but their thoughts influence everyone. They're considered in all matters as people view every issue from that perspective. Yet these scholars aren't highlighted in this distinct way because they weren't primarily focused on legal issues. Instead, They viewed legal matters as part of a larger whole. The first notable scholar in this group is the one who provided a well-defined interpretation of all academic activity in the first 4 centuries, an interpretation that has endured for centuries, namely Imam Al-Ghazali. His seminal work in this area is titled Ihya Ulum al-Din, a 4-volume book. Later, he himself condensed this work for the general public under the title Kimya-e Sa'adat. Both works still exist. He wrote Ihya Ulum al-Din in Arabic. It has been translated into many world languages. Kimya-e Sa'adat was originally composed in Persian. These worldviews have appeared in different eras, yet in this issue, there is no significant difference among them. You know that Maulana Abu al-Ala Maududi devoted a separate booklet to this issue. He explained in detail that Muslims shall punish apostasy. He doesn't consider it a pardonable, but its most notable aspect might be described as a Sufi interpretation of the religion. We need to understand how this Sufi interpretation originated. I have previously discussed in some Q&A sessions that humanity has long sought to comprehend reality. Understanding reality involves looking beyond the physical aspects of things to grasp their essence. Where does this physical world originate? In philosophical terms, this inquiry relates to metaphysics, a major question concerning the origin of the world. How does it progress? Where will it lead? Another major question involves ethics. Do we derive ethical principles from experience? This suggests a distinction between the external world, which we call the physical world, and the internal world within each individual. These scholars posited that if one can manage one's inner self, it could unlock doors to reality, allowing a connection to the higher realm where the divine self resides. Then, one could directly experience reality. This is why they assert the existence of inner selves. One traverses the inner world to reach the ultimate truth. These scholars have developed methods for this journey and have created a specific terminology to describe it. Imam Al-Ghazali is a Muslim and one of the most eminent Muslim scholars. He authored a work titled Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, which translates as the rescue from error. In it, he recounts his personal journey. He states that he met with numerous significant figures of his era, engaged with various schools of thought, and read extensively. He is a capable individual who has influenced entire generations. He describes how he explored the Imamiyyah, engaged with the Taymiyyah, these were the prominent groups of his time, and then encountered the school of thought I mentioned earlier, which focuses on the inner self. He found that this school provided him with a pathway to reality. He was profoundly influenced by this tradition. He writes in his Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal that his search took him far and wide, but once he reached these scholars, reality was unveiled to him within days. He began to see angels while awake. Thus, he chose this path to reality. He is an extraordinary scholar who attempted to view the entire religion through this lens. This is why I characterize his interpretation of religion as a Sufi interpretation. There are Sufi traditions such as Buddhism and the second phase of Hinduism, which began with the Bhagavad Gita. Thus, Imam Al-Ghazali aligned Sufi traditions with Islam, finding a commonality among them. Such efforts had started earlier. It is noted that Junaid Baghdadi had begun establishing such principles much earlier. Likewise, the Brethren of Purity discussed these topics in their gatherings. However, Imam Ghazali's distinction lies in his comprehensive and eloquent expression of the entire background knowledge. It's not that a scholar of his immense stature simply descends from the heavens and begins to teach. He builds upon a history of existing knowledge. Obviously, people had made many discoveries before him. Yet a great scholar comes along and creates history by organizing knowledge in a coherent fashion. This was achieved by Al-Ghazali. Through his efforts, the Sufi interpretation of the entire religion was established. If you survey the Muslim world, I wouldn't hesitate to say that approximately 80% of Muslims adhere to this interpretation. travel from Morocco to Malaysia and observe ordinary Muslims. Although this interpretation has taken various forms, at some places it has remained at a scholarly level, at others it has descended to a middling level, and another it has degenerated and become murkier and become a religion for the common man. Nevertheless, overall, it has remained a source of inspiration. The entire Muslim world accords Imam Ghazali a high status. He is referred to as Hujjatul Islam, the proof of Islam. What does this indicate about his position in the minds of Muslims? Here, I may relate an anecdote which may not be factual, but illustrates his esteemed status among Muslims. The story goes that when the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, ascended to the heavens, he was greeted by Moses, peace be upon him, who questioned, "I heard you state that the scholars of your Ummah are akin to the messengers of the Israelites. How could you make such a profound statement?" The Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, affirmed that he had indeed said this, and it was accurate. Moses, peace be upon him, then requested to meet a scholar from his Ummah to verify this claim. The Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, selected none other than Imam Al-Ghazali for this purpose. The significance of this story isn't whether it actually occurred, but rather what it reveals about the Muslim perception of Al-Ghazali. From among the vast Muslim Ummah spanning centuries, the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, chose Imam Al-Ghazali to substantiate his statement to Moses, peace be upon him. The continuation of the anecdote is quite intriguing. Moses, peace be upon him, asked Al-Ghazali for his name. Naturally, introductions begin with names. Imam Al-Ghazali provided his name along with his complete genealogical lineage. Moses, peace be upon him, remarked, "You've listed all your ancestors. I only inquired about your name." Al-Ghazal responded, "When God asked you what you held in your hand, you explained, 'This is my staff. I use it to gather leaves for my sheep. I perform various tasks with it.' Thus, you detailed the matter, and I did the same." At this point, Moses conceded, "I acknowledge that the scholars of the Muslim Ummah are indeed like the Israelite prophets." I was discussing Al-Ghazali's status. Iqbal himself has stated, "Philosophy remains, but the critique of it by Ghazali does not." There's no doubt that Al-Ghazali was a most sincere man. You are aware that he held a prestigious official position in Baghdad, where he was greatly respected. The caliphs of his era and their ministers held him in high regard. Despite this, he relinquished all that and returned to his homeland. He left behind his worldly engagements. Sufism dominated his life. He taught and mentored many in his hometown despite facing hardships. Many notable figures emerged as a result. His disinterest in the material world is well known. His extensive exposure and study and his profound knowledge across various disciplines of his time are recognized. We know that he authored a critique of the philosophy of his era titled Tahafut al-Falasifa, which Ibn Rushd later contested. In his personality, in his life, he exemplified his understanding and interpretation of the religion perfectly. He is also an exceptional writer. You can gauge this from his Arabic writings, which are so straightforward and fluid that they seem contemporary. If you read another scholar from his time, you might find their writing convoluted and jumbled. There has been such a period. You might have encountered such writing styles in Urdu and English literature, for example, if you have read Chaucer or Milton. But Al-Ghazali's writing is smooth and accessible. He describes himself comprehensively. He brings clarity and explanatory depth to the most subtle and complex themes. Thus, he is a distinguished Arabic prose writer. From this perspective, his interpretation is remarkably accessible. The next individual who significantly influenced the Muslim Ummah and provided an alternative interpretation of the entire religion of Islam is also an extraordinary figure. Imam Ibn Taymiyyah. He has impacted entire generations. However, despite his remarkable persona, he could not surpass the influence of Al-Ghazali during his lifetime. Knowledge seemed to defer to him. Scholars recognize his superior knowledge. He influenced many prominent figures. His student, Ibn Qayyim, was himself a scholar of great repute with a comprehensive grasp of his contemporary fields. It has been aptly stated about him, أما الحديث فلا يعرف ابن تيمية فليس بحديث. As for the hadith not known to Ibn Taymiyyah, it does not exist as a hadith. Additionally, he was well versed in philosophy, scholastic theology, and other related subjects. His work, Al-Rad ala al-Mantiqiyin, is unparalleled. In it, he critically analyzed and dismantled the logic of his time. Similarly, his work, Minhaj al-Sunnah, is another significant contribution. His religious interpretation is known as the Salafi interpretation, which is now widely recognized. You might have noticed that in the West, two terms, Sufi Islam and Salafi Islam, are frequently used in academic settings. Although the Salafi interpretation predated Ibn Taymiyyah, he presented it at a higher level, formulated its arguments, and rigorously critiqued Imam Al-Ghazali. It is said of Al-Ghazali, دخل في بطن فلسفة فلم يخرج أبدا. He delved into the depths of philosophy and never emerged. Similarly, he critiqued major figures of the Sufi interpretation. For instance, regarding Sheikh Akbar ibn Arabi, who is revered with the title Sheikh Akbar, he commented, "He is a Dajjal among Dajjals." Thus, he stands at the opposite extreme, criticizing Sufism and advocating the Salafi interpretation. The foundational principle of the Salafi view is this. He himself explains it. He says that when the Shudi movement was prevalent and Hindus were encouraged to re-embrace their old religion, at that time, Maulana Muhammad Ali Jauhar delivered a speech in the Jamia Mosque of Delhi. While addressing, he wished if someone penned a book and told people what jihad in Islam really is. This statement raises questions. What does my era imply? Generally, it is interpreted to mean the time of the companions and the successors. They were directly trained by the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him. Then they spread far and wide. How did they view these teachings? How did they interpret the Quran and the Hadith? How did they conduct their transactions? What was their community system like? Where did they place various religious teachings? How did they organize these teachings? One might say that an entire group has attained the status of a foundational source for the religion. This is why I refer to it as the Salafi interpretation of the religion, and others recognize it as such. Whenever he would be enraged by an employee, he would thrash him physically. Thus, Maulana Maududi decided it would be against his nature to join the work. Still, however, he had great love for Maulana Muhammad Ali Johar and gave him much importance. Maududi would narrate that Maulana would deliver a speech in the Delhi Jamia Mosque after the Friday congregation. Essentially, the knowledge passed down from the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, forms our fundamental source. From this fundamental standpoint, it holds significant appeal and carries considerable weight. In a sense, it has become a means of reviving our connection to the Quran and the Sunnah. It is said that when published, the work was greatly admired by Allama Iqbal. Moved by this work, Allama got a letter sent to Maududi and invited him to come to Punjab. Syed Nazir Niazi, a trusted fellow of Iqbal, wrote this letter. Maulana Maududi came to meet Iqbal, and due to his encouragement, he moved to Patna. From this perspective, we see that his critique of past approaches was appreciated by scholars of his era. However, his ideas did not gain widespread patronage among the general population. The Saudi Revolution of 1917, however, facilitated the spread of Ibn Taymiyyah's ideas and the Salafi interpretation among the masses. It is a detailed work, you may like to study it. But the basic point I want to communicate is to see how he placed the issue. Let us refresh the issue. We have to eradicate kufr and polytheism. I have already discussed apostasy. The approaches to this eradication of the problem mentioned in classical fiqh are ambiguous. Muhammad bin Abdul al-Wahhab's teachings and preaching were also inspired by the Salafi interpretation. The rulers of Diriyah were drawn to him due to this element. This led to a pact between Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and these rulers, resulting in the end of the Sharif's rule. Sharif was the title of the ruler of Mecca at that time. His governance was replaced by that of Abd al-Aziz bin Saud. Even today, the House of Saud honors this pact. The descendants of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, known as Ali Sheikh, have maintained a covenant or agreement with the royal family, which forms the basis of their governance. We can say that this is the first time in Muslim history that the Salafi interpretation of Islam gained significant traction, and this occurred in the Arabian Peninsula. This rule did not remain confined to Arabia. The royal family became wealthy, and the Saudi government acquired the means to exert influence over the Muslim world through their wealth. Numerous Islamic centers were established. Various institutes called Irshad were founded. These institutes were also established in our country. Many teachers and propagators, referred to as Mab'uthan, were dispatched. Thus, the Salafi interpretation began to significantly impact universities as well. Although it is not as dominant as the Sufi interpretation, this tradition has also gained a prominent position over the years. So, Ibn Taymiyyah is the second significant figure who, following Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Al-Shafi'i, and Imam Al-Ghazali, has influenced Muslims. You might be aware that he was not widely mentioned in India. However, the situation changed when Maulana Abu al-Kalam Azad wrote his work Tazkira. The most striking part of the book is the section discussing Imam Ibn Taymiyyah. He mentions Ibn Taymiyyah with enthusiasm, refers to him as a revivalist of the religion, and thus introduces this great scholar. From one perspective, this was a process through which the Quran and Sunnah were once again emphasized over philosophy and Sufism. As I mentioned earlier, the guidance derived from the companions and the successors forms the basis of the Salafi approach. Due to this, it is called the Salafi interpretation. As a result of this entire process, many new groups emerged in our region as well. The most notable name is the Al-Hadith of the subcontinent. This group is largely driven by the thoughts of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Hazm. Imam Ibn Taymiyyah had a profound knowledge of philosophy and other religions. He wrote an explanatory exegesis of the Bible. This also significantly influenced his work. Additionally, he was an expert in other contemporary religious disciplines such as fiqh and hadith. When he discusses an issue, it appears as though everything is laid bare before him, and he can analyze and elaborate on any topic he chooses. His student Ibn Qayyim writes even better than him. In Ibn Taymiyyah's writings, you encounter a dramatic flair. He discusses topics in such a manner that you might sometimes struggle to determine where a sentence begins and ends. His knowledge is like a flowing sea. In contrast, Ibn Qayyim has an excellent writing style. He has presented his teacher's thoughts in a very beautiful and coherent manner in his books. If you consider both the teacher and the student together and examine the works of Ibn Qayyim as well, you will see that this interpretation of Islam emerges strongly. From one perspective, this represents the middle age of Muslim history in relation to the present day. He influenced many individuals. However, his influence was initially limited to the academic world. The general populace began to be influenced by his ideas only after the establishment of Saudi rule. A government was established, and as a result, people found inspiration. Gradually, this influence spread. In universities and other settings, people refer to the Sufi interpretation and the Salafi interpretation, or Sufi Islam and Salafi Islam. Thus, these two interpretations have become quite popular. This is the story of Ibn Taymiyyah, the next scholar who, as I mentioned earlier, viewed the entire religion and through his analysis changed the landscape in the same way as Ibn Taymiyyah and Ghazali did. Ghazali had cast a spell. Ibn Taymiyyah stood against it and presented an alternative interpretation. This interpretation also possesses great strength, as evidenced by Ibn Taymiyyah's severe critiques of Ghazali and many others. So the third major figure is Imam Waliullah, famously known as Shah Waliullah. a remarkable personality emerged in the Indian subcontinent who possessed a deep understanding of all existing disciplines. He is a great Sufi. He was well versed in the traditional discipline of scholastic theology, which developed under the influence of philosophy. This tradition was critiqued by Al-Ghazali from one side. Ibn Taymiyyah also criticized it. Shah Waliullah had a thorough knowledge of this discipline. He is also one of the great scholars of the hadith science. He wrote 2 commentaries titled Muthana and Musaffa on Imam Malik's Al-Muwatta. It can be said that he beautifully integrated philosophy, scholastic theology, and Sufism. He himself stated, "God has chosen me for this era so that I may gather scattered knowledge and synthesize it, that is, place everything where it belongs." His book Hujjatullah al-Baligha embodies both previous interpretations. On one hand, it reflects the worldview of Al-Ghazali, who was a Sufi. Waliullah himself was a Sufi. Therefore, this narrative also found strong expression in Waliullah. On the other hand, there is the ideology of Ibn Taymiyyah. Presently, I can't give all the details of its different shades. It is only a comprehensive understanding which I am sharing with you. Kufr, polytheism, and apostasy have to be finished. The question of apostasy was clear. Maulana Maududi introduced a new line of argument for it. He has had a significant influence on Muslims, particularly those in the subcontinent, where all subsequent scholars regard him as a sort of imam. They look to him for authenticity. The Deoband was a major movement that arose in our region. If it's not an exaggeration, I might say that the Deoband movement is the most significant movement in the entire Islamic world. It is a very comprehensive movement. I am not discussing the religious thought of Deoband. I am referring to the methodology they adopted. We observe that today, thousands of madrasas are based on the Deoband tradition. Thus, they initiated a significant movement for religious education. Further, very prominent Sufi monasteries, khanqahs, also emerged, one of which is Tanabawan, established by Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanwi. This khanqah influenced a great many people. You are aware that highly renowned individuals like Maulana Syed Sulaiman Nadwi were associated with this khanqah and became mere disciples. Then there is Maulana Abd al-Majid Daryabadi, a great literary figure and a renowned scholar who was also connected to it. The latter wrote a book on Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanwi titled Hakim al-Ummat, which is worth reading. Thus, a multitude of significant figures were linked to it. Subsequently, Maulana Ilyas emerged from the Deoband movement and initiated the largest propagation movement, Tablighi Harkat, in the world. He himself uses the term Tablighi Harkat. There is no doubt about all this, even if you consider the current state as well. I am not analyzing his ideology. I am merely referring to the scope of their work. Similarly, you will find that every jihad movement initiated in the subcontinent was inspired by Deoband. Consider Hafiz Zamin in the past, as well as the War of Independence, 1857. Even earlier, it was Syed Ahmad Shahid who ignited such a passion for jihad. The contemporary Taliban also have their roots in the ideology of Deoband. From this perspective, you can say that Deoband, which represents an extraordinary movement, is inspired by none other than Shah Waliullah. This indicates that Shah Waliullah was an extraordinary figure of great influence. When Shibli quotes him in a discussion, he assumes that he has anchored himself in a truly authentic source. We know that Shibli is not an ordinary writer. Allama Iqbal has discussed Islamic punishment in his reconstruction. It is entirely based on an excerpt from Shah Waliullah's Hujjatullah al-Baligha. So he said the same thing. He came from Rampur. This is what he told me then. This is the first issue. The narrative that prevails today, the narrative which provides a great motivation to you, is not generally known in its depth. It is taught in the madrasas the way I have explained it to you. I have put it precisely and have presented it in a specific way. From this perspective, you can safely say that he was another such individual who emerged to influence and move people. The greatest virtue of this personality is that he attempted to unite and reconcile the Sufi and the Salafi interpretations of religion. He himself claims that his major contribution is to position things where they belong and establish a place for them. Thus, it appears there was no difference between those independent elements. He brings these elements together. There was a significant debate among the Sufis concerning the concepts of Wahdat al-Wujud and Wahdat al-Shuhud. In one of his famous letters, Shah Waliullah addressed this issue and ingeniously demonstrated that both views are essentially the same. Thus, his ability and contribution are highly prominent and have profound effects. All three are major figures. If you observe Muslim world today and consider the interpretation of the entire religion, what is religion? What are its foundations? What are its fundamental elements? How do its parts relate to one another and form a whole? How is this structure organized? Let me provide an example for clarification. On one hand, there are ENT specialists, pulmonologists, and cardiologists, but these doctors discuss the entire human body. These are the doctors who place everything in its proper place. In recent times, we have entered an era of specialization. It is often said that the greatest drawback of this period is that people have become so focused on specific parts that the interconnectedness of things has begun to diminish. Disciplines have become isolated from each other. Initially, philosophy encompassed everything. I mean, the individuals we refer to as philosophers, such as Aristotle and Plato, discussed all these topics. They would engage in logic, delve into metaphysics, address ethics, and analyze the science of their time. They covered everything relevant to that era. Then specialization emerged. People began to specialize in narrow areas. We say that someone is a specialist in a particular part of the heart to the exclusion of other parts. This is the current state of affairs. These men are scholars who consider religion in its entirety. And this point is agreed upon by all. The only questions posed relate to details. The question of when to take action that is debated. I mean, when the scholars discuss this, they take up the validity of the viewpoint. They don't challenge the objective or differ on the narrative itself. The fourth figure of this kind is Maulana Abu al-A'la Maududi. The Maulana is also part of this tradition. He did not critique the Sufi interpretation, but one might say he intentionally overlooked it. Actually, he aligned more with the Salafi perspective. Why then do I consider him separately? The reason is that he advanced the Salafi view, which had, until then, only defined itself in terms of its sources. Let me clarify this point. How do we acquire religion? From where do we derive it? What method do we employ? On these questions, the Salafi view is clear. As I mentioned earlier, it regards the era of the companions and the successors as the original source and expresses the same. For example, the consensus, ijma, of the companions, the consensus of the successors, the tradition of the first Muslim community, etc. From these, it draws primary inspiration. The same is true for Maulana Maududi. He bases his views on these sources. He does not deviate from this path, but he discovered the links between the parts of the Salafi interpretation and gave it a solid structure. This had not been done before Maududi in the detailed manner he accomplished. He addressed all aspects of religion, discussing the objective of religion, the purpose of prophethood, and related issues. He organized all components of the religion and presented this ideology in a new form. In Maududi, all these elements found a new interconnectedness and coherence. Maulana Wahiduddin Khan is not mistaken in using and applying the term political interpretation of Islam in his critique of Maududi. It is Maududi who is the founder of this political interpretation of religion. Maududi's interpretation has also had profound effects. It has been a source of inspiration for many. Individuals from the Muslim Brotherhood, such as Sayyid Qutb and others, refer to him as the Imam of religious preachers and frequently cite him. Thus, His influence has extended to the Arab world as well. His stature has been recognized by the Muslim world of his era. He is also acknowledged globally. You can say that he appealed to the younger generation involved in the movements and politics of that time. His era was a time when Muslims had lost political power. They had been removed from prominent positions. Iqbal had already extolled the glories of past Muslim history, thereby fostering hope for the revival of that glory. With this backdrop, the same background that Maulana Azad had, Maududi presented this interpretation in a new form. People were inspired by this ideology. If you examine various Muslim revolutions, such as the Iranian Revolution, you will find its influences everywhere. When proponents of the Salafi interpretation discuss Islamic issues related to the state, modern economy, or other related topics, they find in Maududi a ready reference. His influence was so significant that even those who oppose him and criticize him, including major scholars, use terminology he introduced in their discussions of collective affairs. They express ideas that were initially formulated by none other than Maududi. If you analyze the Muslim world from Morocco to Indonesia, you will find traces of his influence everywhere. We can conclude that these four great figures, when compared with the four jurist imams, are not lesser in stature in any respect. The jurist imams were experts in a specific discipline. These four are the imams of the entire religion. They have presented the entire religion to the world. You will find differences in these four interpretations regarding their approach to religion, their discussion of sources, and many other aspects. I am only providing a general introduction to these. However, they all concur when it comes to our main topic, that is, the religious narrative about the state. I mean, if you consider their approach to religion as a whole, you will find significant divergences. These differences will also manifest in their placement of religious rulings. But when it comes to our topic, that is, the narrative that motivates Muslims regarding their approach to the state and leads to the resurgence movements, for example Daesh, then you will find that regarding its foundations, these four interpretations do not differ. I will elaborate on this later and analyze its foundations and principles. Here, I only provided a general introduction so that we can proceed to our primary subject and examine how, despite all their differences, these narratives agree on these fundamental political issues. I will analyze this topic, and you will be able to determine that when I stated in my article that we need a counter-narrative, the proposed counter-narrative was not a reaction to the followers of any specific movement, but rather responded to all of them collectively, because in this matter they do not differ significantly. Rather, when I analyze this topic, you will see for yourself that there is indeed little difference among them. Let's conclude this session here. In the next session, we will cover different aspects of this narrative, analyzing it in light of these interpretations so that it is presented before us in a well-defined and precise manner.